talk. This is a little presentation I put together regarding some core elements about the G12 RCMI application, and I specifically extracted from the funding opportunity announcement some elements that talked about RTRN and where RTRN might be in play, may be in there, and ways and strategies to think about how one might incorporate some different approaches to make sure they're addressing the application in a responsive manner. Okay. So one thing is the G12 applications are specifically designed to be flexible, so that they're providing research infrastructure, but it's to be tailored so that each institution is different in the RCMI community. Their needs are a little different, and what works is a little different. And so the grant is designed to say, we have some guidelines here, but you know better what's going to make research work at your institution. The strategy for getting junior faculty to do well and advance is going to be different at different institutions, and so it's not all the same. But at the end of the day, the new application says that the infrastructure through this award should help to advance the study of key diseases that affect minority populations and support basic research that will lead to approaches for the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of diseases to improve health and reduce health disparities. And then foster collaborations among disciplines, departments, and/or schools, and collaborations with other institutions. So that is something that's new, that is actually specifically being required by the RCMI program office. And then facilitate professional development activities in biomedical and behavioral or biobehavioral science. And again, as I said, it's designed to allow flexibility in the type of research resources. But again, unique this time, at least 2/3 of the requested funds are directed to multi-user resources rather than individual research projects. Previously, a large portion of the RCMI project was research projects, and they've gone away from that. But there are opportunities to do research projects, but it's structured differently. So we'll mention a little bit about that. So the old RCMI program, in a sense, is sort of gone. The G12 it's a little new, and I think of it as not the end, but a new beginning. So of the key activities, there are 4 key activities. I don't remember them all. There's administrative core, partners and collaborations, evaluation, and research, design. So, but one of them, number 2, collaborations and partnerships, first, everybody has to do it. Doesn't say who to partner with or how you have to partner per se, but you have to partner. If your institution has other NIH program project grants in your institution, they want to see how you're partnering with those other program project grants. So that's going to be important to have in your application. Of course, it would be really easy if you had all that information in an eagle-eye system, and you could pull it up and have all the information there and make your application process a lot easier. But it also says each applicant must indicate how they will utilize the RCMI Translational Research Consortia and other consortia and resources to facilitate collaborations. So that's new, and that's been put in by NIH. And then some of those resources, if need be, you can use some of your budget to sort of purchase services just like you would for another core service if necessary. And then there are certain services that are just available because they're paid for and funded totally by RTRN. So in the grant, one has to describe their participation in the consortia and how they'll utilize RTRN to facilitate the collaborations and to enhance research within the center. And again, the idea is that ultimately the research is being directed to improve the health of patients in our communities. And then describe how the researchers will collaborate, share, and disseminate resource tools. And that can be a variety of things. We talked earlier today about different strategies for bringing investigators together to talk about partnering, to talk about sharing, to talk about collaborating. So those might be some of the strategies. And then RTRN itself could be a strategy for sharing and partnering. Look, talking about the cluster, and cluster systems could be another strategy for partnering and working together at a national level. Okay? Plans must be included to describe how regulatory requirements that impact the collaborations will be addressed. So we talked about at least how RTRN is going to try to help facilitate the harmonization of IRBs, IACUCs. So those are things that people can put in their application as part of RTRN strategies to try to address IRB issues around collaboration. Others we didn't talk about this morning, but I'll mention now, and it came up at lunch, is sponsored program / finance when you talk about funding across institutions. We've had a lot of problems with the pilot projects and getting subcontracts approved and moving dollars. And so between that and IRB, someone has a one-year pilot project and the year's almost over, and people are like, well, what's happening? And you're like, well, I don't know. I haven't got, grants and contracts hasn't approved my contract yet to get the funding released. And so we have to think about, as a network, and that's something that I think really will be the responsibility of RTRN, at least to take a lead on, how we can create a vehicle to provide more streamlined subcontracting and sharing of dollars across institutions, because you just can't say we want everybody to collaborate and then it's really difficult for people to collaborate. So that, it's hard enough at a scientific level to collaborate, but if from a regulatory and administrative perspective it becomes problematic, then people forget it. Right? So one thing we have to try to do is to take away that barrier out of the collaboration. But I think what will make the application strong is at least letting the reviewers know that the applicant or the applying institution is aware of those challenges and is trying to address them at different levels. So the applicants must indicate the willingness to participate. And willing's important, but there needs to be the removal of barriers. That's also really important. But again, there's the willingness to participate with RTRN, CTSA, or other consortia. And there'll be different consortia depending on areas of research that different institutions will be looking to collaborate with potentially and partner with. Or creating new consortia. It may just be a specific focus between the schools in Puerto Rico for a particular problem where they come together and create almost a new consortia per se. But still, if there's dollars going across institutions for pilot projects, subcontracting, et cetera, those are still issues that need to be addressed. And I guess some other challenges that were brought up earlier, HIPAA, issues around HIPAA with trying to work with local providers and then working with IRBs with local hospitals. So I think those are all potential regulatory issues that at least need to be touched upon in the application, just to let the reviewers know that you're aware, one is aware that those are issues that need to be dealt with. I then looked at the area where it said the review criteria. So what are the reviewers going to look for when they review the section on collaborations and partnerships? Does the center facilitate intra-institution collaboration? And both the Vivo profile system, Eagle Eye, those also help facilitate intra-institutional collaboration. And there are other strategies that each institution has for facilitating intra-institution collaboration. iPads can help facilitate intra-institution collaboration. So we heard, what was it, Oregon? Yeah. Giving out iPads. So different people have different strategies depending on their budget. Right, now that Walter's back, we could, that's why I thought I'd mention it. We'll take a look. Has the applicant included collaborations with investigators from different disciplines, departments, and/or programs within the institution? So first within the institution, and then from other collaborating institutions. So that combination of issues they'll be looking at. Again, the review criteria. If the institution has other RCMI-supported programs, does the applicant demonstrate how the G12 award interfaces with these programs? So particularly the SEPA program, the CRECD training program, the clinical and translational research program. So they're going to look at that first, but then they'll look at other NIH-funded programs second. Has the applicant described their participation in RTRN and how they plan to utilize RTRN to facilitate collaborations? Now, if there's clinical trials, then that becomes, and even particularly multi-site clinical trials, that becomes a sort of easy consideration for working with RTRN. But again, we've talked about a lot of other ways in which RTRN can help facilitate either the conduct of research and or the administrative and regulatory requirements that also are connected to research. And are there a commitment to and plans for participating in the development, adoption, and implementation of best practices through either RTRN or other consortia? So best practices is something that's also emerging. Earlier in the morning, we were talking about the high level of regulatory oversight, focus on accountability, and best practices is sort of one of the strategies or one of the major issues that are being pushed by these regulatory agencies, that you have to, by adopting best practices, it positions you best in navigating through a lot of the regulatory landmines that are out there. In addition to the required G12 activity of partnerships and collaborations, there are two potential key activities that one might choose to put into their application, two of which ask specifically about interactions and interfacing with RTRN. One of them is research design, biostatistics, and research ethics. So it's not required that every application have this in there, but a lot of people have chosen to do this. Innovative research programs that bridge research and study design, biostatistics, and research ethics with other national activities, including those of RTRN. So there are opportunities to work maybe with the biostatistical team, at the Data Technology Coordinating Center, to work with the Research Ethics Committee, and those are partnerships that people might choose to engage in and partner with as part of this portion of the application. And then these are just some of the key research topics that might be undertaken by the Research Design Biostatistics group: preventing bias, improving recruitment and retention, things of that nature. Unique strategies for outreach and inclusion of vulnerable populations. So if somebody is doing behavioral research and they're trying to do surveys, we have a group, they do a lot of work in HIV, and they work specifically in the African American community looking at men who have sex with men and women who have sex with men who have sex with men but don't disclose it. And trying to put out a survey to find that population to answer the survey or get them into studies and into certain focus groups and working groups where they'll have educational materials to try to change behavior is extremely challenging. So what are the strategies to identify vulnerable populations or subpopulations? And so those are things that hopefully this group here can work out. And how do you do it in an ethical manner and a respectful manner? So those are very important issues particularly for the communities that we serve as RCMI institutions. Conflict of interest, federal code requirements, we talked about that. Research safety, so yes, we're all going to bash the IRBs all we can because we want our projects through, but at the same time, not at the expense of jeopardizing patient safety. So we do want to make sure that the safety and the respect of our patients is first and foremost. Will the resource be sufficient for intra and interinstitutional operations? So the research design, biostatistics, and ethics will be sufficient for intra and potentially interinstitutional. And again, for here, as people are putting applications together here in Puerto Rico or in other places in the RCMI community, but particularly for Puerto Rico, one might think about maybe every institution, maybe some institutions have some potential areas and other institutions have other potential areas, but they have enough resources that they can become a core that can support more than one institution. And will the research design and biostatistics components of the translational research network be utilized in multi-site studies? So if you're doing multi-site studies, particularly if you think that those studies and those interventions have potential to be commercializable and you have patents on them and you're thinking about going to the FDA for either a device for a IND for a device or investigational new drug or investigational device, then there are certain formats that are required for that data to be collected, and RTRN provides that. And so people can have that study done in a way that is FDA compliant. Another core that is listed as a potential core is biomedical informatics. So some institutions may feel we have all the biomedical informatics we need, and we're not going to request that in the G12 application. We're going to put our resources in other areas. Others will say, this is our chance to enhance our biomedical informatics. So it's optional, not required. But if they are requested, again, considering the intra-institutional and external interoperability to allow for communication among other RCMI institutions, particularly through the RTRN. Okay, so if there's biomedical informatics, are people thinking about how at least many of those tools might be leveraging the infrastructure that's already been put in place by RTRN, some of the resources, or connecting and thinking about connecting to other resources that are in other institutions, such as we know Ponce is fairly far ahead with Vivo, and we know UPR is fairly far ahead with Eagle Eye, and at least being able to communicate with those institutions to get a better idea of how one's institution might start planning and preparing for moving in that direction. That's something that could be important to put into your application. Applicants should utilize the bioinformatics support services provided by RTRN when conducting particularly multi-site studies and also leveraging resources through the CTSAs. So one thing NIH and NCRR is looking at is how are we and how is the RCMI community using the resources we've already put into these other networks and systems. and it's incumbent upon us as institutions to think about how do we use them, but at the same time, there's certain things you just need on your own campus as well. And so everybody understands that we're all looking to see what we can have on our own campus, but you only have a certain amount of, you have a limited budget for your G12, and so you have, as you think about how you allocate those resources, considerations for the biomedical informatics section if one uses that. So here's the review criteria. The reviewers, when they review it, are asked to look at this section specifically to see if the applicants have addressed these questions. Will the biomedical informatics resources offered be commensurate with the breadth of the RCMI program? And will the support services provided by RTRN be utilized for multi-site studies? So especially something like Oracle Clinical, which is a fairly expensive system, and they're not going to pay for an individual institution to ask to have an Oracle Clinical system in probably, or some other fairly expensive system put in place. Now there are other systems that are not that expensive that are still very effective systems for clinical trials, such as REDCap, which is used very commonly, I'd say, at least in the CTSA community. I believe it's not presently, I could be wrong, I think it's not, I know it's moving toward being FDA compliant. It's not presently FDA compliant, but again, a lot of projects people do, they're not working to get FDA approval. And so you just have to be thoughtful about it, because it is a lot more work to get your project developed and entered into the Oracle Clinical system than it is into the REDCap system. So, no, you have options. Yes?
In terms of compliance with federal regulations for FDA supported studies, the software is an important part, but even if you get the software, it's the whole process that needs to be certified. So you may have, you may have a software that's compliant, but if the other parts of the study, data collection system and everything are not certified, you still have problems. I just wanted to make sure.
That's a great point. Great point. Yeah. So be very thoughtful. If you're thinking about going down the route of getting a therapeutic or device approved by the FDA, be aware that it's a fairly extensive process, and you need to take a thoughtful approach to make sure every element from beginning to the end is thought through and addresses every potential regulatory issue that's going to be needed for the FDA to give sign-off on that. And again, the interoperability of informatics systems, particularly to communicate with other RCMI institutions, and how one might be working with RTRN to make sure that people position themselves appropriately. So these are just some of my thoughts on potential strategies to being responsive. I'm sure there's a lot of other thoughts out there. One, we talked about the ambassador program. So that's one strategy that at least can address the issue about having thought groups and looking at research collaborations both at the institutional and also at a national level. So having those ambassadors is one strategy. These are just some of the characteristics that we sort of discussed that might be considered for such an ambassador. But again, knowledgeable, really being able to drive research at the institution as well as drive collaborations across institutions. It may or may not be the ambassador that helps facilitate the science and resource directory, but that may be a good person who can at least help direct an individual who's going to be inputting that data into those systems. Because but at least you want somebody who has a good breadth of knowledge of the research that's going on, who the investigators are, and at least could play a role in helping to move that forward. We talked about Eagle Eye as a potential tool for discovering resources, and again, it allows individuals to make these queries to find these resources, but only after that information's been entered into the database. So we have to make sure that that happens. And then the network is planned to be part of the Eagle Eye testbed community, so that's going to be a very positive contribution that the network hopefully will be bringing to the individual RCMI institutions. Another potential or optional area for the G12 application is the pilot grant program, or small grants program. So previously, a major component of the G12 was research projects. And it was always tough doing these research projects because they were not supposed to be as big as R01 projects, but they were supposed to be bigger than R21 projects. So they were usually 4 or 5 years, and they were a couple $100,000, and it was tough when they were reviewed. If it was a really good project, they'd say, well, this should be an R01. Why is this in here? And if it's not as good, they say, well, it's not that good. Why is it in here? So it's hard to have a project that fit just right for the application. Now, it's not even putting the grants in with the application. It is describing the process by which the institution will create a small grants program to evaluate the small grants. And then there's the opportunity to talk about how one will leverage the description of the small grants program to say how you're promoting collaborations at the institution. So we heard some small grants programs say there has to be one basic scientist and one clinical or behavioral scientist as part of the application. And that's one way to promote collaborations if you do that. For some of the RCMI clinical and translational research centers, several of the programs have structured the small grants program to say some of these will be targeted for partnered projects with the RTRN pilot or RTRN small grants program for co-funding there. And that is a little easier because there's more clinical trials going on. But those again are ways in which the clinical and translational research centers address this issue in their application. Core labs. For me, I would love to see people taking their core labs and taking a close look at their core labs and saying, for proteomics and HIV, we want our core lab to be the core lab for the entire RCMI community, because we have the best HIV-related proteomics core lab in the whole RCMI community. And so our plan in our application is going to be to put some additional infrastructure in there, and we're going to make this not just an institutional resource, it's going to be a national resource. And people will be able to use it from other institutions. There'll be a service charge that they'll have for using it, et cetera, et cetera. But this is going to be a national highlight. And then someone else at another institution will have a different core that will be a core like that. One challenge each of our institutions has, or most of our institutions have, particularly around core labs, is do we have enough investigators to justify having a core lab? Or if we have enough samples being run, is there enough diversity of investigators? So if there's only 2 investigators that are primarily driving the core lab, then when it gets reviewed, they say, well, this is just a core lab for these 2 people over here. This is an institutional core lab. This is a Keith and Zoe core lab. So by being able to expand the user base by becoming a national resource, and hopefully by having a service that is clearly in demand by investigators across multiple institutions, can really help justify why one has a core lab, and through a sort of recharge mechanism can help make that core lab more sustainable. Because most of our institutions may not have the investigator base to keep a core lab being sustained without additional investments from the institution. And that becomes challenging, particularly as resources become small.
I was just thinking, Keith, that if the core lab is going to move from sort of local use to a national resource, there may be a need, because sometimes you buy sophisticated equipment, and it's for because it's a single user facility almost.
Mm-hmm.
Others might use it on occasion. But there may be a need for a high throughput sampling. So that means an investment in, different sampling chambers and so forth for high throughput use. So you may want to think about ways in which we could, for a core lab that's, characterized as a national core lab, maybe there's some consideration given to helping them move to that status. Some may be already like that, like at UTEP, they have, high throughput
Right.
Bioimaging facilities for cancer screening. And they're already set up to do that, but others might not be.
So some of those, certain microscopies, and so the other things. Yeah. There are some institutions, probably not RCMI institutions, but at some institutions there's probably an electron microscope on every floor in a building, maybe 2. And so, again, just something to think about. Some language that I extracted from a Clinical and Translational Research Center grant application to transform the research enterprise into a highly integrated translational research environment by reorganizing the research administration, centralizing and enhancing physical and intellectual resources, and promoting participation in RTRN and CTSI. Small grants and pilot awards, priority will be given to those that focus on health disparities and or multidisciplinary research, use RTRN as a resource for multi-site research, or test novel technologies and methodologies. So each institution will decide what the details are, but some of that language, I think, helps to ensure that your application is responsive, particularly to what the reviewers are going to be asked to comment on. You want to make sure, you want to make it really easy for the reviewers. They cut and paste that out and put that in their review. Yes, they did that. Affiliation with the RTRN Data Technology Coordinating Center will offer technological resources that will promote translational research, sharing innovative research tools and information technology resources, inter and intra-institutionally, basic and clinical research teams dedicated to improving the health of disadvantaged communities will be able to accelerate the process of translational research. So, some stuff like that. How working with RTRN will help move that forward. The Coordinating Center offers an array of services in clinical and data project management, and I think that's what Jose was talking about. It's more than just the software, but it's the project management that has to be complete and needs to be familiar with what the FDA is looking for from a regulatory perspective for people who are moving in that direction. And I think we should be thinking about that. As we talk about our financial constraints at our institutions, while the #1 currency for the NIH's publications, another acceptable currency is development of new technology, and that would be including but not limited to patents. But patents and developing patents that could be commercializable and lead to income streams is something that I think we have the capacity to do at our institutions, but we don't think about it enough, and it's not promoted enough. But if we want to become more independent financially, we're going to have to do that. And so I think people need to be thinking about how to do that. And although for promotions, publications tend to carry more weight than patents, particularly if things are getting commercialized, carry more and more weight. Because believe me, there's no department chair or dean that wants to not promote a person and let them go who has a couple of patents with a couple of companies that's bringing in $1 million or $2 million a year, and hold on to somebody else who has just a whole bunch of papers. So everybody's being a little more sophisticated around what they consider important deliverables by faculty members. Providing training and help support desk, that is really important. That's the Data Technology Coordinating Center. Clinical management system for clinical researchers to collaborate data in a safe and regulated environment, and streamlined standardized system for managing study participants and their data collected during clinical trials. Now, even if one is not doing clinical trials, probably important for some of the core labs to be cognizant of what clinical trials are going on. Because that core lab may say, and some investigators may say, gosh, that study that's going on, and the young lady who was here over there earlier talking about some of the G proteins related to diabetes, so we have a study for looking at vitamin D supplementation in patients with low vitamin D levels. It's a clinical study. We look at non-invasive measures of cardiovascular function, but we also have a subset of patients we've done fat biopsies on. And we have blood samples that we've collected and urine samples that we've collected and stored. So there's an opportunity to do proteomic analyses, to do, if one's interested in looking at certain genes or signal transduction, signaling pathways in those samples. Those are possibilities. And so if one looks and sees some of the clinical studies that are going on, by contacting the investigator directly, you can tap into and maybe say, I have a hypothesis or idea I want to explore, develop a collaboration, and now you're linked in to an active clinical study where you can get samples and do analyses and have a partnership going. So just because you're not a clinician and may not be active doing a clinical trial doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about how you can tap into some of these clinical trials. And right back to where we began.